Sirens sounded when the first Supes tore through the avenue, tearing store fronts and flinging cars like toys, the kind of public spectacle that draws cameras and nightmares in equal measure. A line of Vought PR vans had been overturned and set ablaze, their logos screaming from burning metal while civilians scattered beneath a cathedral of falling glass and concrete, and military helicopters circled with floodlights that only made the shadows deeper. In the middle of that impossible noise, a figure folded into the ruined block, not a parade hero or a calculated asset, but a living avalanche. Green shoulders, aching restraint, an animal force held on a leash by a man who had learned to count his breaths. He was not full rage. He moved like someone who kept a volcano on a diet of apologies, each step precise until it wasn't, and in the heat of the riot the leash would fray fast. This is only the beginning, and whatever comes next will not stop at damage. It will redraw the lines that everyone thought were permanent. If you watch this to the end, listen closely. Subscribe now and brace yourself, because what starts here will keep unraveling, and when I say that, I mean lives, power, and the rules you take for granted will change in ways you can't undo. They were tearing the city open in a way that left no neat edges, just ragged pieces of urban life scattered across asphalt and store glass, and the cameras were eating every second. Supes moved like controlled hurricanes, disturbing whole blocks with a casual cruelty that came from the certainty of protection, and beneath them civilians ran with the kind of small, private panic that turns ordinary people into animals. In the middle of that choreography of destruction, a green shape folded into the ruined avenue, guided by a man who kept touching his own throat as if checking the last fragile fuse of himself. Bruce Banner walked like a man carrying a grenade, and the grenade was his anger. He did not step forward to fight. He stepped forward because the wall of screaming people made containment impossible, and because something about the way the Supes tore through the crowd made restraint itself a moral test. That first moment was not an eruption. It was a held breath, a deliberate choice to stand in harm's way and try not to become the harm. Bruce Banner's control framed everything the first few minutes, and that mattered because it meant the Hulk's power did not begin at full tilt. It built. Banner stayed close enough to a public microphone for the cameras to catch the trembling in his fingers as he worked a cable, and he spoke in measured, clipped sentences to the handful of reporters within reach, telling them he was looking for a place to help, not to hurt. His voice was a small, fragile promise under the roar, and that promise shaped how the crowd reacted, if only briefly, because people needed to believe someone was trying to stop the bleeding. But control is something the mind has to hold against a weather that keeps changing, and when a Supe shoved a woman back into the flow of looters, when a child was flung like a rag into a storefront, Banner's breaths got shorter, and the tether he kept on the green thing behind him frayed. The Hulk answered to that fraying with muscles that tightened and a face that tasted the air for threat. His first movements were large and precise, not blind. The Supes around them treated this arrival like an uninvited player walking onto a set where the script still mattered. A train zipped across the scene with that ridiculous, arrogant grin he always used for crowds, more worried about video than victims, and a less-known Vought-backed heavy move to intercept with the practiced arrogance of someone who'd been told the world was theirs to manage. Starlight hovered back, hands half-raised because the instinct to protect civilians beat against the corporate training drilled into her. She wanted to help Banner, and she wanted at the same time to believe Vought would give the right orders. The crowd's cameras pivoted and the feed became a mirror, Hulk versus Supes, and every angle a possible moral judgment. On the sidewalk, Billy Butcher and Huey watched from behind a burned-out cab, and Butcher's face changed like someone tasting a memory he hated. For him, this was not about public safety, it was about calculus. A big green threat in a town of licensed sociopaths was either a tool or a storm. He barked command at Huey to get closer, not to help Banner, but to see what the world would break into first. Vought did what Vought did first. They staged. The PR trucks that had been overturned in the first wave of violence became props for a narrative that had to travel faster than the fire. A line of CEOs in suits appeared on screens, their faces perfectly lit, saying they were activating containment protocols and asking for calm while teams of trained assets moved to the location. The message was precise and smaller than the moment. It was a vow to handle things, which is to say to control perception even while physical control lagged behind. That public spin pulled more cogs into motion. Press helicopters tightened their circles. Official-looking men in tactical gear set up temporary perimeters. And in the sky, a single surveillance chopper trailed the green shape like an announcer following the main act. PR and containment do not stabilize a riot. They professionalize it, turning chaos into theater with A-list actors, and theater is always dangerous at ground level. The first real clash happened because someone thought to make money from the moment. A junior Vought Supe, an enthusiastic mid-tier powerhouse who had been promised sponsorship and fame, darted in front of Banner with a flat, performative heroism, aiming a showy strike at the greenback he didn't fully understand. The strike landed. It was light compared to what Homelander could do, but heavy enough to bruise flesh and crack the brittle peace Banner had been knitting. The Hulk flinched, not from pain but from the affront to Banner's attempted order, and the green figure moved with the speed of a panic finally given permission. He threw the Supe aside like a rag, and the rag did not bounce, it tore, shredding uniform and reputation both, and crashed into a bank window where glass rained over the crowd. That was the kind of physics the world would note. Escalation that started because someone wanted the spotlight, and a response that made that want deadly. Homelander watched from altitude before he descended, and his approach was a performance of ownership. He cut through cloud and drone wash like a missile that was also an advertisement, his face composed so the feeds could capture just how unbothered the world's most powerful Supe was by a green interloper. But under that composure, there was the same animal rule that governed Banner. Ego increases pressure. Homelander hovered, issuing a voice that was equal parts curious and condescending, asking the Hulk if he knew whose city he'd wandered into, and the cameras drank it up. When Homelander landed, the ground groaned with the heat of his presence. He did not strike first because the show required an assertion of dominance, not a sudden kill. He circled, he taunted, and that taunting was a precise cut aimed at an intelligence wrapped in muscle. The Hulk answered with a growl, short, non-verbal and rooted in defensive logic, and the crowd's mood pivoted from spectacle to something darker. The military response began as rules, then became force. Local police tried to push perimeters outward while special units coordinated with government liaisons, and orders were given that were meant to look like restraint even when their intent was blunt. Non-lethal rounds tried to drop the green figure's mobility, sonic emitters aimed to overload perception, and sedative charges were called in as if the situation were a laboratory test rather than a live human scene. Those measures failed on a simple physiological basis. As Hulk's anger rose, his pain threshold and regeneration climbed with it, and the sedatives could not find their mark through swelling muscle and an adrenal that burned with purpose. A dart nicked skin and did nothing but irritate. A sonic pulse made the Hulk rear and smack a bus into a lamppost in an attempt to escape a sound that felt like a promise of harm. Each failed attempt fed the next spike of anger, and Banner's face, visible for a moment in the press light at the base of the neck, showed a man running out of words with his own mind. What tipped the evening from dangerous to irreversible was not a shout or a single blow but a sequence. Homelander, feeling snubbed by a display that suggested any power could rival his, pushed harder. He struck the ground with a show of power meant to intimidate, and the shock rolled through soil and sewer alike, destabilizing a nearby temporary triage tent that had been sheltering injured civilians. The tent collapsed like a cage, and inside, people who had hoped to escape death folded into a new, immediate death. The cameras cut live to those faces, and in that cut the spin doctors lost control. Banner, whose whole plan at arrival had been to keep harm from becoming worse, lost the thin restraint that had kept the Hulk's hands measured. Something fundamental in him snapped, and the green thing's reaction was not just anger but a categorical rejection of the idea that people could be used as props. He hit the ground with a force that no longer tried to be precise, and the shockwave rolled outward to ripple windows, topple scaffolding, and set a cluster of fuel canisters on an alleyway alight. Flames chased the first responders back, and a government liaison on a field net began barking that escalation protocols be upgraded. The last image that edged the end of that night was not a tidy frame, but a city being remade by physics and pride. Homelander hovering, face drawn, the Hulk braced and larger than any headline had promised, Vought's PR van smoldering like theater props left to burn, and a siren line of military transports closing in under the glow of a flare-up that would not be contained by slogans. People were already counting the dead in pockets and under rubble, and the feeds were full of faces that would not be put back together by apologies. Bruce Banner was gone from public sight, subsumed by something that followed only one rule. It got stronger the angrier it became, and the next order of business was not spin or persuasion but survival, which is the language governments and corporations resort to when containment fails. By the time the first military convoy forced its way past the outer barricades, the riot had stopped being a riot and started behaving like a war zone that nobody had officially declared. Smoke from collapsed scaffolding drifted across intersections that still carried traffic lights blinking uselessly, and medevac crews moved in stuttering patterns because the ground kept shifting under impacts that no ordnance had caused. The Hulk stood at the center of that instability, not at full rage but trending toward it with each new stimulus, his movements already larger than they had been minutes ago, and his tolerance for proximity nearly gone. Banner's earlier attempt to keep him focused on evacuation routes had dissolved under the sight of that triage tent collapsing, and now the green body moved with the blunt logic of removal. If something came at him, it was pushed away, and if pushing didn't work, it was thrown. That cause-and-effect simplicity became the architecture of the next few minutes, and every decision by the Supes around him either calmed or sharpened it. Starlight was the first to try to change the direction of the storm without feeding it. She moved between a group of trapped civilians and a collapsing awning, pulling a man free while throwing a glance toward the Hulk that mixed fear with a professional recognition of raw power. Her voice came over a shared Vought channel, urging de-escalation and suggesting that whatever this was, it wasn't behaving like a typical rogue Supe. That mattered because it gave Vought's field team a reason to hesitate before committing lethal force, and hesitation is a resource in situations where brute response multiplies damage. But hesitation also looked like weakness to Homelander, whose patience was already threadbare from being ignored by a creature that didn't acknowledge hierarchy. He floated lower, eyes burning with a heat that bent air, and he spoke again, not to negotiate, but to provoke a reaction that would justify his dominance on camera. The first real exchange between them was messy because neither side fully understood the other's thresholds. Homelander's initial I-beam was controlled, a narrow, surgical line aimed at the Hulk's shoulder rather than his head, and it carved through green skin in a way that would have crippled anything else on the street. The injury bled for a moment and then began to close, the Hulk's regeneration accelerating as anger spiked in response to the pain, and the next movement he made cracked the pavement like a dropped safe. He lunged not with strategy, but with a reflex that prioritized distance from the source of harm, and his fist met Homelander's midsection, with enough force to launch him through the front of a pharmacy that had already been looted down to its bones. The building took the impact badly, its internal supports giving way in a cascade that turned the storefront into a funnel of falling brick. Cameras caught Homelander rising from that debris with a smile that was more snarl than charm, and the mood on the street shifted from curiosity to dread. Butcher saw that shift and leaned into it the way he always did when the world started looking honest. He grabbed Huey by the collar and dragged him into a service corridor that gave them a lateral view of the confrontation, muttering that this was the first time he'd seen someone hit Homelander without immediately dying for it. For Butcher, The green giant was not a savior. He was a variable that could either balance the equation or turn it into something unrecognizable. He started making calls to contacts in intelligence who had long ago written off Supes as a permanent condition, and he framed the situation in terms that would interest them. An unlicensed asset that did not respond to Vought's chain of command and whose power scaled with provocation. The responses he got back were immediate and cold, promising a layered intervention that would not ask permission from corporate handlers. That external pressure would matter in the next phase, because once governments decide they own a crisis, they tend to expand it until it fits their tools. On the ground, Vought's containment teams switched from sedatives to heavier options that had been held back for optics. Sonic cannons were rolled forward and calibrated to frequencies designed to disrupt balance and cognition, and a net of high-tensile cable was prepared in the hope that entanglement might buy time even if it couldn't end the threat. The cannons fired in staggered pulses that made the air shudder, and for a second the Hulk's posture changed, as if he'd stepped into a wind that pressed directly on his inner ear. That discomfort translated into a burst of motion that was less precise than before. He grabbed a streetlight and used it as leverage to vault over the first cable deployment, landing hard enough to crater a bus stop and send shrapnel skittering toward a police line. The cables snapped as his muscles swelled, the tensile strength calculated for anything short of this failing under a physics they had not modeled. Each failed restraint raised the temperature of the encounter, and the public feeds began to carry the language of catastrophe rather than control. Homelander came back into the open with less restraint than before, his ego now fully engaged by a crowd that had seen him knocked through a building. He did not bother with a warning this time. He slammed into the Hulk at speed, driving him into a parking structure whose lower levels collapsed like stacked cards. The impact swallowed 3 parked cars and buckled a support column that had held for decades, and the resulting tilt turned the upper decks into a slide of grinding metal. The Hulk's response was immediate and visceral, his anger spiking not just from pain but from the awareness of civilians scrambling in those upper levels, and his next shove lifted Homelander just enough to break the grapple. He roared a sound that carried no words but plenty of intent, and brought both fists down on the concrete, sending a shockwave that rattled windows 3 blocks out and knocked a line of soldiers off their feet. That was not a tactical choice. It was an organism making space. Government liaison channels lit up with authorization codes that escalated the intervention from local to federal. A flight of drones appeared over the skyline, their payloads calibrated for high-impact containment rather than dispersal, and the order was given to deploy kinetic penetrators in a ring that would drive the Hulk toward an open zone. The first of those struck the ground nearby, punching into asphalt and detonating with a concussive force that blew out the remaining glass in adjacent storefronts. The Hulk staggered and then grew more massive in posture as the pain and the perception of coordinated threat compounded his anger, his skin knitting over fresh cuts even as new ones were made. Starlight shouted into the channel that this would only make it worse, but the chain of command had already decided that worse was acceptable if it looked like control on paper. In the confusion, A-Train attempted a high-speed tackle that ended with him ricocheting off the Hulk's side and skidding across a crosswalk in a tangle of limbs, a reminder that speed without mass has limits. The confrontation widened because the environment refused to hold steady. A gas main ruptured under the cumulative impacts, feeding a fire that rolled down an alley and into the mouth of a subway entrance where people had taken shelter. Firefighters tried to push in and were driven back by a rain of debris shaken loose by another exchange between Homelander and the Hulk, and the sense of a single fight turned into a layered disaster. Banner's influence, which had once guided the green body toward exits and safe routes, was now only visible in the brief moments when the Hulk turned away from clusters of civilians rather than through them. Those moments were shrinking as the barrage continued, and the calculus of anger began to dominate every reaction. Homelander, seeing the military commit, grinned in a way that suggested he would not share the stage much longer, and he wound up for a strike that would aim to end the spectacle decisively. As he closed, the drones began their second pass, and the combined stimuli, heat, noise, pain, threat, pushed the Hulk into a new tier of response that the earlier sedatives had not even approached. He caught Homelander mid-lunge and pivoted with a force that sent both of them through the side of the parking structure and into the street beyond, where a line of armored vehicles had just formed. Metal screamed as one of those vehicles was crushed between them, and the remaining units opened up with munitions that had been signed off minutes before by someone far from the blast radius. The city's skyline flickered as power substations tripped under the load, and for the first time that night, the emergency broadcast system cut into every screen with a message that did not promise control, only instructions to shelter. The event in motion had become something that would not fit a press release, and the next minutes would belong to whoever could withstand the consequences of making it worse. By the time the emergency broadcast interrupted every remaining signal in the district, Vought had already begun rewriting the story in a way that would survive the footage. The first internal memo didn't call Hulk a man or a victim of circumstance. It labeled him an unregistered hostile meta-entity, a phrase designed to collapse nuance into liability. Screens in boardrooms filled with heat maps that marked not just destruction but brand risk, and executives who had never set foot in a riot debated the optics of escalation with the same tone they used for quarterly earnings. Ashley Barrett's voice cut through a dozen overlapping channels as she demanded a containment narrative that would cast Homelander as the stabilizing force, even as he traded blows in a collapsing parking structure. The priority was simple. The public had to believe that Vought had invited this fight and was winning it, or at least that it would. Outside, the Hulk's physiology made a mockery of the tools being deployed against him. His regeneration had already sealed the narrow beam burn Homelander left earlier, and as new impacts landed kinetic rounds from federal drones, the concussive wake of Homelander's passes, his muscle density climbed in response to anger that had nowhere safe to go. This was not a plateau. It was a curve that steepened with each attempt to restrain him, a feedback loop where threat became fuel. Banner's earlier restraint still left fingerprints on behavior, visible in the way the Hulk swerved away from a cluster of EMTs hauling a stretcher, but those fingerprints were smearing under stress. A sonic cannon pulsed again from the perimeter, and the discomfort translated into a ground strike that buckled a median and flipped a squad car onto its roof. Each failed measure made the next one harsher, and the system's logic moved toward brute solutions. Starlight pushed back on that logic in the only way she could, by going public against it. She grabbed a fallen camera rig and addressed the live feed with a plea that was half explanation, half warning, saying that escalating force was making the green figure stronger rather than weaker. She named Vought's containment protocols as insufficient for an adversary whose power scaled with emotional provocation, and for a moment the chatter on social channels reflected a split that PR could not immediately close. That split mattered because it threatened to turn the narrative from rogue threat contained by heroes into corporate negligence creates catastrophe, and Ashley's response was immediate. A counter-message rolled out within minutes, suggesting that Starlight was compromised by trauma and urging viewers to trust official statements over on-the-ground speculation. The corporate immune system was working, even as the body it protected was being dragged through concrete. Butcher, watching from the service corridor with Huey pressed to his side, recognized the shift from spectacle to institutional panic. He didn't care about Starlight's credibility so much as the opportunity her descent created, because it meant Vought's internal discipline was fraying. He made another call, this time to a contact in a defense contractor that had once flirted with anti-Supe countermeasures, and asked a question that would have sounded insane an hour earlier. What would it take to redirect federal assets toward Homelander rather than the Hulk? The answer came back in the language of jurisdiction and political appetite, both of which were changing as casualty reports ticked upward. Butcher relayed what he could to Huey, framing the green giant as a wedge that might finally split a monopoly on violence that had lasted too long. In the background, a new siren cut through the smoke as heavier transports rolled into position. Homelander's ego had fully replaced his earlier curiosity by now, and the corporate chatter only sharpened it. He landed in the open, daring the Hulk to follow, and delivered a speech that was meant for the cameras about responsibility and strength, positioning himself as the only thing standing between the city and annihilation. The speech lasted exactly as long as it took for the Hulk to cross the distance with a low, defensive growl, closing in response to a perceived threat rather than rhetoric. Their next collision took out the corner of a municipal building that had survived the initial riot, and the debris rained down in a way that forced firefighters to retreat from a newly ignited blaze. Homelander's heat vision flared wider this time, less surgical and more punitive, and the Hulk's answering shove drove him into a line of federal vehicles that had been staging for a coordinated advance. The exchange told a simple story. Dominance claimed on camera had to be defended in concrete. Inside Vought Tower, legal teams began drafting language that would shift liability toward government intervention, arguing that federal munitions had exacerbated the threat. At the same time, a quiet request went out to deploy Black Noir under a mandate that allowed lethal discretion, a move that acknowledged the limits of Homelander's ability to manage perception while fighting for real. The plan was to layer stealth and precision over brute force, hopping to find an angle that didn't inflame the Hulk's anger further. But even that calculus ran into the same biological rule. Injury increased his capacity to endure, and failed attempts would not calm him over time. A test strike from the perimeter, a shaped charge aimed at his lower back, detonated and left a crater that he climbed out of angrier than before, skin already knitting along the edges. The public feed captured that climb, and the word containment began to feel like a lie. Government command, now fully invested, authorized a citywide expansion of the operational zone that would evacuate not just the riot district, but adjacent neighborhoods. That decision widened the stage in a way Vought could not spin as targeted heroism, and the movement of armored columns through residential streets made the crisis visible to people who had only watched it on screens. Power was cut to prevent further gas ignitions, plunging blocks into a dark that was only broken by firelight and the strobing of emergency beacons. In that dimness, the Hulk's silhouette grew larger as he braced against another pass from Homelander, muscles responding to a cascade of stimuli that had not let up for nearly an hour. Banner's influence flickered again when the Hulk pivoted to shield a group of evacuees from falling masonry, but the pivot cost him a direct hit that would have killed anything else. The regeneration that followed was faster than before, a physiological escalation that the system could not outpace. As the corporate response hardened into denial and the government response into siege, a new layer of resistance entered the field. A black-clad figure moved along the rooftops toward the epicenter, unseen by most cameras, but tracked by a handful of thermal sensors that fed into a federal command post. Black Noir's mandate was simple and brutal: end the threat by any means that would not leave Vought holding the bill. He carried tools calibrated for silent penetration and high-impact restraint, none of which had been tested against something whose power increased with anger. The first of his charges landed against the Hulk's flank as Homelander drove him back, toward an intersection that had been cleared for heavy deployment, and the resulting blast staggered but did not stop him. Instead, it produced a roar that rolled down the empty streets and rattled the loose signage left by evacuation. The event already in motion now had a new vector, stealth layered over spectacle, and as Black Noir closed in for a second attempt, federal batteries aligned for a synchronized strike that would turn the intersection into a containment bowl. Vought's PR team began drafting a statement that would praise interagency cooperation, even as the cooperation on the ground took the form of overlapping fire. Homelander, sensing the shift in attention, angled for a decisive blow that would recenter the narrative on him alone. The Hulk turned toward the new threat on instinct, his anger spiking at the sensation of a second attacker in the dark, and the ground beneath them began to fracture under the cumulative stress of the night. The synchronized strike that Federal Command had lined up did not land on an empty stage. It landed on a city already moving under evacuation orders, and that meant every shockwave had somewhere to go. The intersection they had cleared for a containment bowl became a basin for force, and when the first battery fired, the concussive ring lifted dust and signage in a circle that rolled outward into side streets where residents were still packing cars. The Hulk staggered under the impact, and then straightened with a posture that was visibly larger than it had been 10 minutes before, his musculature responding to the barrage with a tightening that made earlier restraints feel theoretical. Banner's influence flickered in the angle of his shoulders as he turned away from a bus full of evacuees, but the turn brought him into Black Noir's path, and the second silent charge detonated against his ribs. Pain registered as a stimulus, and the response was immediate. Anger rose, regeneration accelerated, and the next movement he made cracked a lane divider like a twig. Black Noir adjusted with professional calm, shifting from charges to a grappling attempt designed to redirect rather than injure, but the physics did not cooperate. The Hulk's durability meant the initial grip found purchase, and then lost it as swelling muscle displaced the hold, and Noir was flung across a storefront that had already been shuttered for the night. He recovered quickly, he always did, and re-engaged from a blind angle, aiming for the back of the knee where leverage sometimes mattered more than mass. The strike landed and bought a half-second of instability, which Homelander used to drive forward with a shoulder that had taken tanks through walls before. Together, they forced the Hulk down into a crouch that buckled the pavement and made the nearby street lamps shiver in their sockets. For a breath, it looked like coordination might succeed where solo dominance had failed. Vought's internal feeds lit up with that image and Ashley seized on it, pushing a live caption that framed the moment as multi-asset containment. She spoke over a split screen of Homelander and Noir, praising their teamwork while legal prepared language that would credit federal support without ceding authority. The narrative was already outpacing the reality, because the reality was a body that did not calm under restraint. It hardened. The Hulk's growl deepened into a sustained rumble that carried across the emptying blocks, and when he pushed back, the motion lifted both attackers enough to break their alignment. Homelander caught himself in midair, but Noir skidded, his boots carving twin grooves in asphalt that had softened under nearby fires. The cameras caught that break, and the word containment began to trend with a question mark. Starlight moved with the evacuees now, guiding a line of families toward a subway entrance that had been cleared after the earlier gas flare was contained. She kept looking over her shoulder, because each new impact from the intersection sent a tremor through the stairwell, and the ceiling dusted her hair with concrete powder. Her voice returned to the public feed despite Vought's attempts to cut it, and she said again that escalation was feeding the threat, that the more they hit him the stronger he would get. A few firefighters nodded without meaning to, because they had seen something like it in smaller forms, panic making people lift weights they couldn't otherwise move. But this was not panic. It was a physiological rule that the system kept testing with bigger hammers. The line of evacuees kept moving, even as the city lights blinked off in a planned blackout that turned the skyline into a silhouette. Butcher and Huey left the service corridor when the blackout hit, slipping into the open because darkness leveled the playing field a fraction. Butcher's phone buzzed with a confirmation he had been pushing for. Federal jurisdiction had expanded to include the possibility of counter-Supe targeting if civilian casualties continued to climb. He didn't smile. He rarely did when the stakes got honest, but he told Huey that the fight had just changed categories. If Homelander could be framed as exacerbating the crisis, then assets might be redirected in a way Vought could not publicly oppose. They moved toward a vantage that overlooked the containment bowl, keeping low as a drone passed overhead with a payload that hummed like a warning. For Butcher, the green giant was still a storm, but storms can be steered if you know which pressure to drop. In the intersection, Homelander abandoned the speech he had prepared and committed to force that would look decisive from above. His heat vision widened again, not as a scalpel, but as a sheet that cut across the Hulk's shoulder and down into the street, igniting spilled fuel in a ribbon of flame. The pain that followed was immediate and severe, and the Hulk's response was to close distance in a way that made the air pop around him. He grabbed Homelander's cape at the base and used it as leverage, swinging him through the facade of a municipal records office that had survived the first collapse, and the building's interior went with them in a cascade of shelving and dust. Black Noir followed, silent and efficient, but the floor gave under the combined weight and turned the ground level into a sink of broken concrete. Each collapse removed another place for civilians to hide, widening the conflict beyond the cleared zone. Federal command saw the structural failures and made the call that turned a district problem into a city problem. They authorized the deployment of heavy containment munitions along 3 adjacent avenues, effectively boxing the fight into a corridor that ran toward the river. Armored units advanced with shields raised, and the first of the heavier penetrators punched into the asphalt ahead of the Hulk, detonating with a force that lifted a taxi onto its side. The intent was to herd, not to destroy, but the distinction mattered less to a nervous system that read impact as threat. The Hulk's posture changed again, broader now, and his regeneration closed the worst of the burns even as new ones opened under Noir's precise strikes. Banner's earlier preference for open exits manifested in a turn toward the riverward streets, and the system took that as compliance rather than instinct. The blackout made the fires brighter, and as the corridor lit with orange, the silhouettes of Supes and soldiers moved in overlapping layers that confused even seasoned responders. A train returned to the edge of the fight with less bravado, attempting to redirect debris away from a line of retreating medics, and nearly lost his footing when a shockwave rippled the ground. Starlight's glow flared at the mouth of the subway as she pulled the last family through, then turned back because leaving the field felt like surrender. Homelander burst from the records office with concrete dust trailing him, eyes bright with a rage that had finally found a mirror, and angled for the Hulk's head with a strike meant to end questions. The Hulk met him with a forearm that split the air, and the impact sent a pressure wave down the corridor that blew out the remaining storefronts. The fight moved with the evacuation now, spilling into neighborhoods that had never expected to see Supes trading blows at street level. Windows shattered in apartment blocks 2 avenues over, and a parked ambulance rocked as a shock rolled through its chassis. Federal batteries recalibrated for the narrower streets, and a drone dipped low enough to cast a shadow across Butcher's face as he watched the green figure turn again toward the river. The next deployment would land in a residential grid that had only just been cleared, and the margin for error was gone. By the time the fight spilled into the residential grid, the federal response had shed the last pretense of crowd control and taken on the posture of a battlefield doctrine that had never been meant for American streets. Armored columns advanced in staggered lines along avenues that were still littered with abandoned strollers and suitcases, their turrets tracking a green silhouette that moved between burning intersections with increasing momentum. The blackout that had been intended to prevent secondary ignitions now gave thermal optics an advantage, and from a command post 3 miles out, officers watched the Hulk's heat signature flare and stabilize in ways that suggested a body adapting faster than their models allowed. Banner's earlier influence could still be inferred from the direction of movement toward the river, but each new impact from kinetic rounds or Homelander's passes pushed anger higher and made that influence harder to see. The first artillery-adjacent munitions were authorized with language that emphasized containment through pressure, a phrase that would look sterile in a report and catastrophic on the ground. Homelander did not wait for those rounds to land before reasserting his claim to the narrative. He rose above the rooftops and descended with a force that cratered a cul-de-sac, daring the Hulk to follow into a space that had been emptied minutes earlier by a hurried evacuation. The gamble was simple: make the exchange look decisive in a place where civilian collateral would be minimal, then let Vaught's feeds do the rest. The Hulk answered the provocation with a movement that was less precise than before, closing distance in a bound that collapsed a low brick wall and sent lawn ornaments skittering across asphalt. Their collision flattened a parked sedan and snapped a street sign at its base, and the shock rolled down the block into houses whose windows had already been taped for storms that never came. Pain registered, anger rose, and the Hulk's regeneration kept pace with the widening of Homelander's heat vision, which had shifted from warning to punishment. Black Noir entered the cul-de-sac from the opposite end, coordinating by instinct rather than radio, and aimed for a tendon with a blade that had parted reinforced cabling. The strike landed and bought a fraction of a second, enough for Homelander to drive the Hulk back into a garage that had been left open in the rush to leave. The structure collapsed around them in a tidy cascade of drywall and beams, and the debris plume briefly obscured the cameras that had followed at a safe remove. From the command post, the moment looked like leverage, and the order was given to deploy a ring of heavy penetrators at the ends of the street to seal the box. The first detonations lifted mailboxes and shattered the remaining porch lights, turning the cul-de-sac into a basin of dust and orange glow. That pressure did not calm the Hulk. It narrowed his world to sources of harm, and the push that followed threw Noir through a chain-link fence into a neighbor's yard. Vought's internal debate over optics was overtaken by the government's appetite for decisive action. A liaison from the Department of Defense cut into Ashley's line with a request that was not framed as optional. Air support would be brought in to maintain the corridor to the river, and Vought assets were expected to coordinate or clear out. The message carried a subtext that even Homelander could hear. The monopoly on violence was being shared, at least for the night. Ashley pushed back with language about proprietary risk and civilian safety, but casualty figures scrolling across a second screen undercut the argument. In response, she authorized a live statement praising interagency cooperation, even as legal drafted indemnity clauses that would shift blame if the next phase went badly. The corporation had moved from control to mitigation. Starlight reached the edge of the residential grid with a handful of firefighters who had refused to leave the last house without its elderly occupant. She helped carry the man to an ambulance that had found a pocket of safety behind an armored unit, and the gratitude in his eyes cut through the corporate chatter still ringing in her ear. When the next shockwave rattled the vehicle, she turned back toward the cul-de-sac despite orders to stand down, because the pattern was clear now. Each new hit made the Hulk stronger, and the hits were coming faster. Her warning went out again over a channel that Vought could not fully mute, and this time it was picked up by a federal analyst who had been tracking the regeneration curve. He flagged the data to command with a note that read less like advice and more like alarm. Butcher and Huey arrived at a rooftop that overlooked the sealed street just as the first low-flying jets cut across the river line. The sound hit a second later, a tearing roar that made Huey flinch, and Butcher set his jaw in something like satisfaction. He had wanted the fight to leave the realm of heroics and enter the realm of policy, because policy had levers that fists did not. On his phone, a message confirmed that rules of engagement had been amended to include the possibility of counter-supe interdiction if an asset was deemed to be exacerbating the threat. Butcher didn't need the amendment to name the target in his head, and he watched Homelander's silhouette with a patience that had been years in the making. The Green Giant was still the storm, but storms could be used to justify measures that had been unthinkable that morning. In the cul-de-sac, the garage debris shifted as the Hulk pushed up through it, skin already knitting where Noir's blade had found tendon. His posture was broader than it had been even in the intersection, and the ground cracked under a step that left a footprint in poured concrete. Homelander met him again, this time with a downward strike that drove them both into the street and set off the first of the airdropped penetrators at the block's edge. The blast rolled through the houses and out into the avenue, knocking loose roof tiles that clattered like hail. The Hulk's roar answered, and the shove that followed sent Homelander skidding into a parked armored unit, which dented around him with a metallic groan. The system's logic had created a loop it could not break. Apply force, increase anger, increase capacity to withstand force. Command gave the next order with a reluctance that did not change its content. A battery of heavier munitions would be staged along the riverfront to ensure the corridor held, and if necessary, the fight would be driven into open water where collateral could be managed. The movement of those units began immediately, their headlights cutting through smoke as they took positions along the last residential blocks. Black Noir rose from the yard where he had landed and rejoined the approach, his mandate unchanged by the evidence accumulating against it. Homelander lifted off again, eyes fixed on a target that refused to yield to hierarchy, and angled toward the riverward avenue that had been cleared by evacuation. By the time the corridor reached the riverfront, the event had stopped belonging to a single city and started appearing on screens in war rooms half a world away. Satellite feeds replaced helicopter footage in command centers, where the language of intervention was not tempered by public relations, and analysts began mapping the Hulk's regeneration curve against the cadence of impacts he had taken. The conclusion was unsettling in its simplicity. The more they hit him, the more he adapted, and the faster he returned to the fight. Banner's earlier influence still showed in the direction of travel toward open space, but the barrage that had shepherded him there had also elevated his anger to a tier no local model had predicted. Governments that had tolerated Vaught's monopoly on superhuman force now watched a corporate asset struggle against an unlicensed anomaly, and the appetite for oversight began to look like necessity rather than politics. At the river's edge, federal batteries completed their alignment with a precision that would have been reassuring in any other context. Heavy containment munitions were staged to fall in a staggered pattern that would drive the fight toward the water, where shock could dissipate without taking apartment blocks with it. The first of those landed short as Homelander dove in again, his shoulder driving the Hulk into a concrete embankment that spiderwebbed under the impact. The pain registered and was answered by a shove that sent Homelander skipping across the surface like a stone, his cape trailing spray as he righted himself midair. Black Noir used the opening to plant a charge along the Hulk's flank, and the detonation pushed him toward the lip of the river with a plume of dust and steam. Each stimulus fed the same rule, and the posture that rose from that plume was larger still. Vaught's response to the widening scrutiny was to invite it on their terms. Ashley authorized a live international briefing that framed the crisis as a joint operation under Vaught's leadership, emphasizing Homelander's role in preventing the threat from reaching denser neighborhoods. The footage she selected showed his earlier rescues and omitted the exchanges that had collapsed the triage tent, a curation that bought minutes but not trust. Questions from foreign press cut to the heart of the matter, whether corporate heroes could be held accountable when their methods escalated a threat, and the legal team fed her answers that deferred to federal command. That deferral was strategic. If governments were now invested, they would share the blame if the next phase failed. In the background, stock tickers dipped as markets reacted to a disaster that had crossed the threshold into systemic risk. Starlight reached the riverfront with a column of responders and found a landscape lit by flares and burning debris. She could see the Hulk braced against the embankment, Homelander hovering above the waterline, and Noir moving along the shadows cast by a grounded drone. Her warning went out again over an emergency channel that had been opened for interagency coordination, and this time it was answered by a federal scientist who had been tracking metabolic response under stress. He confirmed in clinical terms what she had been saying in plain language. Continued application of force would likely increase the target's resilience and output. The implication was clear, and it ran counter to every doctrine on the table. Command acknowledged the data and proceeded with the deployment anyway, because withdrawing under fire carried its own risks. Butcher and Huey watched from a maintenance gantry that overlooked the staging area, their vantage giving them a view of both the fight and the machinery gathering to shape it. Butcher's phone buzzed with a secure message that read like an inflection point. Allied governments had authorized intelligence sharing on Vaught's internal protocols, citing the immediate threat to civilian life. It was not the takedown he had wanted, but it was the first crack in a wall he had been pushing against for years. He told Huey that the fight had gone global without leaving the riverbank, and that meant decisions would be made by people who did not care about brand partnerships. The green giant below was still an unknown, but the certainty that Homelander could not unilaterally define the response had changed the field. On the embankment, the Hulk pushed off the fractured concrete and met Homelander in midair with a forearm that turned his approach into a tumble. The impact sent a pressure wave across the water that rocked a line of police boats holding position offshore, and the next heavy munition landed at the avenue's mouth with a detonation that rattled the gantry where Butcher stood. Black Noir closed again, aiming for a joint with a tool that had immobilized lesser threats, and found his grip slipping as swelling muscle displaced leverage. The Hulk's response was not strategic. It was a defensive sweep that sent Noir into a stack of flood barriers with enough force to scatter them into the river. Regeneration closed the worst of the burns, even as Homelander's heat vision cut across his back in a flare that lit the shoreline. Command gave the order to commit the Riverfront battery in full, and the staggered pattern began to fall. Each detonation herded the fight toward the waterline, lifting slabs of concrete and tossing them into the current. The Hulk's growl rolled across the river and into the dark beyond, and his next bound carried him onto a maintenance pier that groaned under the load. Homelander followed, eyes bright with a rage that had found no purchase in dominance, and the two of them vanished into a plume of spray as the pier gave way beneath their weight. The boats offshore scrambled to reposition, their wakes crossing in patterns that spoke to a coordination pushed past its limits. International feeds cut from commentary to live evacuation instructions as the fight moved onto the water, and a second line of aircraft appeared on radar from an Allied base upriver. Vought's briefing shifted tone to emphasize partnership, while legal prepared for inquiries that would arrive before dawn. On the river, the Hulk rose from the collapsing pier with a posture that dwarfed the railings, and Homelander angled in for another pass that would look decisive from the air. The next detonation landed at the shoreline behind them, and the shock rolled forward, pushing both toward deeper water. When the maintenance pier finally tore free from its moorings and vanished beneath the surface, the river stopped looking like an escape route and started behaving like a second battlefield with fewer places to stand. Searchlights from police boats cut across churning water that now carried chunks of concrete and twisted railings, and the wake from repositioning hulls slapped against the embankment in a rhythm that matched the distant thud of delayed detonations. The Hulk rose from the collapse with a posture that had become unmistakably larger than it had been at the start of the night, his shoulders set against the current as regeneration sealed burns that would have ended anything else. Banner's earlier preference for open exits translated into movement toward the darker channel, but the barrage that had driven him there had also elevated his anger to a level where even that instinct fought against the urge to remove every new source of harm. The fight had shifted from streets to water, and with it, the nature of resistance. Homelander came in low over the surface, using the reflection of the searchlights to mask his approach before driving forward with a strike aimed at the Hulk's jaw. The contact forced the green figure back a step that sent a surge rolling toward the nearest boat, and the crew aboard scrambled to keep from being swamped. Pain registered as another addition to a growing ledger, and the Hulk's answer was a shove that lifted Homelander clear of the water and into a spray that glowed under the lights. Black Noir used the moment to close along the embankment, planting a charge on a fragment of pier that he kicked toward the Hulk's side. The detonation staggered without stopping him, and the next sweep of an arm scattered a line of floating barriers into the current. Each failed attempt to immobilize hardened the same curve Command had been warned about, and the space between dominance and resistance narrowed. Starlight moved along the riverwalk with responders who had traded hoses for stretchers, pulling two officers from a capsized patrol craft and dragging them clear of a collapsing railing. Her glow flared as she braced against a shockwave that rippled the water into a pattern of crossing wakes, and she kept talking into the interagency channel, even as Vought tried to cut her feed again. She told them that what they were seeing now was not a stalemate but a feedback loop, that every coordinated strike was teaching the target how to endure more. A federal analyst answered with clipped confirmation, forwarding a live update that showed recovery times shortening under sustained barrage. The data moved up the chain and met a doctrine that had already committed too much to step back without looking weak. Butcher and Huey shifted along the gantry to keep the fight in view as it moved downstream, their boots ringing on metal that vibrated with each distant impact. Butcher's phone buzzed with a second authorization that broadened the amended rules of engagement, allowing countersuit measures if an asset's actions were judged to escalate the threat beyond acceptable thresholds. He read it once and then again, because the phrasing was the closest anyone had come to admitting that Homelander might be part of the problem. Huey asked what that meant in practice, and Butcher said it meant someone in a distant room had decided the narrative was less important than the body count. Below them, a police boat swung its searchlight across the Hulk's back, and the beam caught skin knitting along a fresh burn. Vought's live briefing pivoted to emphasize Homelander's endurance, cutting to angles that showed him returning from each exchange without visible fatigue. Ashley spoke of resilience and coordination, praising Black Noir's precision as he moved along the shoreline to re-engage. Legal fed her language that framed the river deployment as a humanitarian measure designed to protect dense neighborhoods, and for a moment the words found traction in a feed hungry for reassurance. Then a second Allied aircraft formation appeared on the horizon, and the implication that this had outgrown a corporate response began to seep into the coverage. Partnership became the new refrain, even as control slipped. On the water, the Hulk's movements grew less tentative as footing gave way to buoyancy, his steps sending waves that slapped against hulls and pilings alike. Homelander's heat vision flared across the surface in a wide arc that turned spray into steam, and the pain that followed was answered by a bound that carried the Hulk onto the bow of a police boat. The vessel dipped under the load and then rebounded as he pushed off, using the momentum to meet Homelander midair with a forearm that cracked like a rifle shot. Black Noir closed from the embankment, aiming for the base of the neck with a tool that had immobilized enhanced targets before, and found it slipping as swelling muscle displaced the angle. The defensive sweep that followed sent him skidding along wet concrete into a stack of sandbags that burst under impact. Command authorized a new pattern for the Riverfront battery, one that would stagger detonations along the downstream channel to keep the fight from reaching a commercial port. Each impact lifted water into curtains that fell back in sheets, and the boats offshore adjusted again to avoid being pushed into one another. The Hulk's growl carried across the channel, and his next step sent a shock through the water that rocked a fire rescue craft hard enough to throw a medic against the rail. Regeneration closed the worst of the new cuts even as Homelander angled in for another pass, his posture betraying a frustration that cameras could not quite hide. Dominance claimed had become dominance contested, and the resistance he faced was not strategic so much as biological. Starlight reached the end of the riverwalk where flood barriers had been staged, and she turned back toward the channel because leaving felt like abandoning the only voice arguing for a different approach. Her feed broke through again long enough for her to say that if they wanted this to end, they would have to stop hitting him. The suggestion hung in the air between doctrine and desperation as the next Allied formation came into range. On the water, Homelander descended with a strike that drove both of them beneath the surface for a heartbeat, and when they rose, the shoreline behind them lit with a fresh detonation that pushed the fight further downstream. Downstream, the river narrowed between a pair of aging industrial districts that had been cleared in a hurry, and the staging lights set along the floodwalls gave the water an artificial dawn. Evacuation buses idled on higher ground, while responders moved in controlled bursts along access roads, and every new detonation from the staggered battery pushed spray into the air like weather that had learned to hate geometry. The Hulk's silhouette cut through that spray with a posture that had grown broader under the night's cumulative stress, regeneration sealing burns even as Homelander's widened heat vision traced new ones across his back. Banner's earlier bias for open exits translated into a drift toward the darker channel beyond the last pier, but the barrage that had shepherded him there had also elevated his anger to a point where even instinct felt like friction. Resistance was tightening now, not just from Supes but from the system itself. Homelander adjusted his approach in response to the changing terrain, staying low over the surface to deny the Hulk a stable target while driving him away from a fuel depot that Command had flagged as unacceptable collateral. The tactic bought seconds, and in those seconds, Black Noir closed along the flood wall, planting a line of microcharges in a pattern designed to redirect rather than wound. When they went off, the concussive push staggered the Hulk toward a cluster of anchored barges, and the metal hulls rang as he collided with the nearest one. Pain registered, anger rose, and the next shove he made sent the barge slewing sideways into its neighbor with a crunch that twisted mooring lines. The water answered with a surge that rocked a rescue craft hard enough to stall its engine. Vought's live briefing had become a relay of talking points that emphasized partnership while quietly disclaiming liability. Ashley praised Homelander's adaptability and Noir's precision, and Legal fed her phrases that would survive a congressional inquiry. A split screen showed international commentators parsing the footage with the language of treaties rather than heroics, and the company's stock dipped again as markets reacted to the possibility that corporate assets could no longer define their own engagements. Inside the tower, a risk officer flagged the metabolic report Starlight had been amplifying and asked whether continued force was counterproductive. The question was logged and deferred, because Doctrine had already committed to a course that looked like action from the air. Starlight moved with a team of divers along a service ramp, helping haul a capsized patrol officer onto a stretcher while keeping her eyes on the channel. Her feed slipped through the interagency net long enough for her to repeat the same warning in plainer terms. Every hit was making him harder to stop. A federal scientist responded with a live chart that showed recovery intervals compressing under sustained barrage, and for a moment the line of responders around her went still. Command acknowledged the data and adjusted the detonation pattern to maintain the downstream corridor, a compromise that kept the plan intact while nodding to the risk. The tightening resistance was as much bureaucratic as it was physical. Butcher and Huey relocated to a crane platform that overlooked the barges, the height giving them a view of Homelander's passes and the Hulk's increasingly forceful counters. Butcher's phone buzzed with a secure update that broadened the amended rules of engagement yet again, allowing countermeasures if any asset's actions demonstrably increased the target's output. He didn't say Homelander's name out loud, but Huey didn't need him to. Below, a drone dipped to drop a containment net that unfurled across the water's surface like a second skin, its high-tensile weave anchored to the flood wall. The Hulk hit it a moment later, and the snap that followed sounded like a cable parting under a load it had never been rated to bear. On the channel, Homelander took advantage of the brief entanglement to drive forward with a strike that forced the Hulk against the side of a fuel barge, and the impact set off alarms that wailed across the district. Black Noir closed again, aiming for leverage at the base of the spine, and found his grip slipping as swelling muscle displaced the angle. The defensive sweep that followed sent him into a stack of flood barriers that burst under impact, their sand spilling into the river in a pale cloud. Regeneration sealed the worst of the new cuts even as the next allied formation came into range, its shadow crossing the staging lights. The tightening had become a vice. Command authorized the deployment of heavier Riverfront munitions along the last industrial bend, a move that would keep the fight from reaching the commercial port beyond. Each detonation lifted water into curtains that fell back in sheets, and the barges strained at their moorings as the current shifted under them. The Hulk's growl carried across the flood walls, and his next bound took him onto a service catwalk that groaned under the load before tearing free. Homelander followed, eyes bright with a frustration that had replaced the earlier certainty, and the two of them vanished into a plume of spray as the catwalk gave way. International feeds cut from analysis to evacuation instructions for districts miles downstream, and Vought's briefing shifted again to emphasize joint command. On the water, the Hulk rose from the collapse with a posture that dwarfed the railings, and Homelander angled in for another pass that would look decisive from the air. The next detonation landed at the bend behind them, and the shock rolled forward, pushing both toward the port's outer markers. By the time the port's outer markers came into view, the fight had stopped resembling anything that could be contained by doctrine and started looking like an argument between forces that answered only to physics and pride. Container stacks loomed in the staging lights like silent witnesses, and cranes that had spent decades lifting cargo now swung empty over water that churned with the wake of boats forced to retreat. The Hulk moved through that industrial geometry with a posture that had grown unmistakably larger under the night's cumulative provocation, regeneration closing burns that Homelander's widened heat vision opened seconds before. Banner's earlier influence still tugged him toward open water, but each new detonation behind him made that instinct feel like surrender to an attack he could no longer ignore. The corridor had delivered them to a place where damage would scale by the ton. Homelander descended over the container yard with a velocity that dented a shipping crate at touchdown, daring the Hulk to meet him on a surface that would not give way like water. The challenge was answered in a bound that buckled the asphalt between painted lines and sent a ripple through the nearest stack, and the collision that followed drove both of them into a tower of containers that folded with a metallic groan. The cascade turned aisles into walls of falling steel, and responders on the perimeter were forced to retreat as debris rained across access roads. Pain registered as another addition to a ledger already full, and the Hulk's shove lifted Homelander through a crane's lower framework, twisting metal that had held under hurricane winds. Each impact became a broadcast, and the word containment fell away from coverage in favor of survival. Black Noir moved along the catwalks with a precision that had ended enhanced threats before, aiming for joints and leverage rather than spectacle. He planted a shaped charge at the base of a knee and detonated, buying a stagger that Homelander used to drive the Hulk into a refrigerated container that burst under the load. The coolant that spilled across the ground flashed into vapor under the heat of Homelander's next pass, and the cloud that rose made the yard feel like a stage for something mythic rather than municipal. The Hulk answered with a defensive sweep that sent Noir into a crane's support, strut hard enough to bend it, and the resulting shift made the suspended boom swing out over the water. Regeneration sealed the worst of the new cuts, even as the yard's alarms began to howl. Starlight reached the port's perimeter with a team that had been retasked from evacuation to triage, pulling a longshoreman from beneath a fallen ladder and dragging him clear of a line of stacked pallets. Her feed broke through the interagency net long enough for her to repeat the warning that had become a refrain, and this time it was echoed by a federal analyst whose live model showed output rising with each coordinated strike. Command acknowledged the data and authorized a heavier pattern along the yard's edge to keep the fight from reaching fuel storage, a decision that traded one risk for another. The detonation that followed lifted a forklift onto its side and sent a wave of dust across the loading lanes. The conflict had climbed into a tier where every solution created a new problem. Butcher and Huey watched from a warehouse roof that vibrated with each distant impact, their vantage giving them a view of Homelander's frustration as it replaced the earlier certainty. A secure message arrived that confirmed what Butcher had been pushing toward. Allied intelligence had begun drafting contingencies that treated corporate assets as potential multipliers of threat rather than guaranteed solutions. He didn't need to explain the implication, and Huey saw it in the way he leaned forward as Homelander drove the Hulk back into a stack of steel that toppled toward a line of emergency vehicles. The green giant's next step left a footprint in the yard's poured surface, and the shove that followed sent Homelander skidding across a lane into a container marked for hazardous materials. The yard's alarms climbed in pitch. Vought's briefing struggled to keep pace with footage that now showed infrastructure failing under repeated exchanges. Ashley spoke of resilience and joint command, praising Homelander's endurance, while Legal prepared statements that would deflect blame if a tank farm ignited. International commentators stopped debating heroics and started asking about liability under treaty, and markets reacted in real time. Inside the tower, a risk officer flagged the metabolic reports again and asked whether a pause might reduce output. The suggestion died under the weight of a plan already in motion. On the yard floor, Homelander widened his heat vision into a sheet that cut across the Hulk's shoulder and down into a line of empty chassis, turning rubber into smoke. The pain that followed was answered by a bound that carried the Hulk onto the base of a crane, and the forearm that met Homelander midair cracked the support cable with a report that echoed across the port. The boom swung free, smashing into a stack of containers that burst open under the impact. Black Noir closed again from the shadows, aiming for the base of the neck, and found his leverage slipping as swelling muscle displaced the angle. The defensive sweep that followed sent him into a floodlight tower that flickered and died. Command authorized the portage battery in full, and the staggered pattern began to fall along the outer lanes. Each detonation lifted dust into curtains that fell back across painted warnings, and the responders on the perimeter adjusted to avoid being driven into the water. The Hulk's growl rolled across the yard, and his next shove drove Homelander through a stack of pallets and into a line of bollards that bent around him. Regeneration closed the worst of the new cuts, even as the next Allied formation came into range overhead. International feeds cut from commentary to emergency advisories for districts beyond the port, and Vaught's briefing shifted again to emphasize cooperation. On the ground, the Hulk turned toward a new source of threat along the tank farm's access road, and the ground beneath them began to fracture under the cumulative stress of the night. The next detonation landed at the yard's edge, and the shock rolled forward toward the fuel storage. When the first detonation landed along the tank farm's access road, it did not look like the others that had herded the fight all night. It looked like a decision that had accepted collateral as the price of control. The shock lifted gravel and warning cones into the air and rattled the ladderways that climbed the nearest storage cylinder, and the responders on the perimeter felt the vibration in their teeth. The Hulk turned toward that new source of threat with a posture that had grown broader under hours of sustained provocation, regeneration closing the worst of the burns that Homelander's widened heat vision kept reopening. Banner's earlier bias for open exits flickered as a hesitation when a line of workers emerged from behind a forklift, but the barrage that followed erased the pause. The system had driven the conflict to a place where loss would not be contained to footage. Homelander descended between the Hulk and the nearest tank, daring him to meet force with force in a space where the consequences would be measured in blast radius rather than broken glass. The challenge was answered in a bound that cracked the asphalt and sent a ripple through the berms designed to contain spills, and the collision that followed drove both of them into a ladder cage that peeled away like foil. The impact rang the cylinder with a tone that carried across the yard, and alarms began to howl in a register that responders had been trained to fear. Pain registered and anger rose, and the Hulk's shove lifted Homelander into a bank of gauges that shattered under the load. Each exchange now threatened to turn infrastructure into shrapnel. Black Noir moved along the catwalks with the same precision he had shown all night, planting a charge at the base of a valve assembly with the intent to redirect rather than rupture. The detonation staggered the Hulk toward the berm, and for a second the angle looked like it might carry him away from the tanks. Then a second Allied munition landed short, the concussive wave pushing both combatants back into the access lane where a maintenance truck had been abandoned. The truck slid underfoot and slammed into a pipe rack, and the rack answered with a metallic groan that made nearby engineers flinch. The defensive sweep that followed sent Noir into a control kiosk hard enough to burst its door, and the yard's alarms climbed another step. Starlight reached the tank farm's perimeter with a team that had been retasked from triage to evacuation, pulling 2 technicians from beneath a fallen railing and dragging them toward an armored bus. Her feed broke through the interagency net long enough for her to say that they were about to lose more than buildings if this continued. A federal analyst answered with a live model that showed output rising with each coordinated strike, and the line of responders around her went still. Command acknowledged the data and authorized the heavier pattern along the yard's edge anyway, because withdrawing under fire carried a different kind of loss. The detonation that followed lifted a pallet jack and sent it tumbling into the lane. Butcher and Huey watched from the warehouse roof as Homelander drove the Hulk back into the berm, their vantage giving them a view of the tank's riveted seams. A secure message arrived that confirmed a contingency had been drafted to treat any asset exacerbating the threat as subject to interdiction, and Butcher's jaw tightened as he read it. Below, the Hulk's next step left a footprint in packed gravel, and the shove that followed sent Homelander skidding into a bank of piping that flexed under the load. The yard's alarms cut through the roar of aircraft overhead, and the first of the tank's relief valves hissed under pressure. The fight had found a fault line. Vaught's live briefing stumbled as footage from the tank farm replaced earlier shots of container stacks, and Ashley pivoted to emphasize joint command in a tone that could not hide strain. Legal fed her phrases about unforeseen variables and cooperative response, but international commentators had already begun to ask about industrial risk. Markets reacted in real time, and a risk officer flagged the tank farm as an unacceptable exposure. The suggestion of a pause died under the weight of a plan already in motion. On the access road, Homelander widened his heat vision into a sheet that cut across the Hulk's shoulder and into the berm, turning gravel into smoke. The pain that followed was answered by a bound that carried the Hulk into the ladderway of the nearest cylinder, and the forearm that met Homelander midair dented the tank's skin with a report that echoed across the yard. Black Noir closed again from the shadows, aiming for leverage at the base of the spine, and found his grip slipping as swelling muscle displaced the angle. The defensive sweep that followed sent him into a bank of warning placards that tore free under impact. Command authorized the portage battery in full along the tank farm's perimeter, and the staggered pattern began to fall. Each detonation lifted dust into curtains that fell back across painted hazard lines, and responders on the perimeter adjusted to avoid being driven into the access lanes. The Hulk's growl rolled across the yard, and his next shove drove Homelander into the relief manifold with a force that bent it against the tank. Regeneration closed the worst of the new cuts, even as a seam along the cylinder's side began to weep. International feeds cut from commentary to emergency advisories for districts beyond the port, and Vaught's briefing shifted again to emphasize cooperation. On the ground, the Hulk turned toward a new source of threat along the manifold as the first leak atomized under the heat of nearby fires. The next detonation landed at the berm behind them, and the shock rolled forward into a vapor cloud that began to spread. The vapor cloud did not announce itself as catastrophe. It arrived as a pale drift that caught the staging lights and made the tank farm look briefly theatrical. Then the alarms changed pitch, and the responders on the perimeter began to move in a way that had nothing to do with doctrine and everything to do with survival. The Hulk's posture, already broadened by hours of sustained provocation, turned toward the manifold where the first leak had atomized, and the next pass from Homelander's widened heat vision traced a line that flashed white in the haze. Banner's earlier influence flickered as a hesitation when a team of technicians stumbled into view, but the barrage behind him erased the pause. Regeneration sealed the worst of the burns even as the air itself became a threat. Homelander drove forward with a strike that forced the Hulk against the ladderway, and the impact rang the cylinder with a tone that carried across the yard. The vibration traveled through piping that had never been designed for this kind of load, and a secondary seam along the tank's side began to weep. Black Noir moved along the catwalks with practiced calm, planting a charge at a valve assembly in a last attempt to redirect the fight away from the storage line. The detonation staggered without stopping, and the defensive sweep that followed sent him into a control panel that burst under impact. Each exchange now threatened to turn a managed leak into an ignition source. Starlight reached the access lane with a team that had been trying to clear the last of the yard hands, pulling one man from beneath a fallen railing while shouting into a channel that crackled with overlapping orders. Her warning broke through long enough to say that they needed to stop hitting him now, that the air itself would carry the cost if they didn't. A federal analyst answered with a live model that showed ignition probability climbing with each heat event, and for a moment command hesitated. Then another Allied munition landed short at the berm, the concussive wave pushing both combatants deeper into the cloud. The compromise between doctrine and data collapsed into a choice already made. Butcher and Huey watched from the warehouse roof as the first flash ran along the manifold like a thought made visible. The ignition was not a fireball at first, but a line of light that traveled faster than anyone could track, and then the tank's skin bulged under pressure that had nowhere to go. The blast that followed lifted the access road and folded the ladderway into itself, turning steel into shrapnel that arced across the yard. Homelander was thrown clear in a tumble that dented a bollard on landing, and the Hulk disappeared into a plume that climbed higher than the cranes. The yard's alarms cut off mid-wail. Vaught's live briefing cut to a static slate as feeds dropped under the electromagnetic surge, and Ashley's voice vanished from international screens. Legal teams shifted from indemnity to crisis, drafting statements that would survive an inquiry into industrial negligence. International commentators stopped speaking in hypotheticals and started listing treaties that would apply to a cross-border environmental event. Markets halted trading on multiple exchanges as the blast wave reached the port's outer markers. The conflict had taken a piece of the world with it. On the ground, the secondary explosions came in a stagger that matched the earlier battery, each one lifting more of the yard into the air. A stack of containers toppled into the access lane, and a crane's boom snapped under heat that had never been in its design envelope. Black Noir rose from the debris with a hitch in his gait and moved toward the epicenter, mandate unchanged even as the landscape failed. Starlight dragged a responder behind an armored bus as burning fragments rained across the asphalt. The river beyond the floodwall heaved under the pressure wave. When the plume thinned, the Hulk rose from the crater with a posture that dwarfed the berm, skin already knitting along a dozen new cuts. His growl rolled across a yard that no longer had lanes, and his next step left a print in concrete that had been poured to resist spills, not gods. Homelander lifted from where he had landed, eyes bright with a rage that had found no purchase in dominance, and angled in for another pass that would look decisive to no one left watching from the perimeter. The final collapse had begun. The tank farm did not burn cleanly. It failed in layers, each secondary blast peeling another piece of certainty away from the night. Fire ran along piping that had carried routine loads for decades, and the floodwalls that had been meant to hold spills now caught a rain of molten fragments. The Hulk rose from the crater with a posture that had been shaped by hours of sustained provocation, regeneration sealing cuts even as heat warped the ground beneath his feet. Banner's earlier instinct to move toward open water flickered once more when a line of responders staggered into view beyond an armored bus, and the turn that followed carried him toward the river rather than through them. It was a small decision inside a catastrophe, but it changed the geometry of the last minutes. Homelander came in hard over the broken berm, unwilling to concede the field to something that refused hierarchy. His strike drove the Hulk toward a service trench that had been exposed by the first blast, and the impact rang against rebar that now jutted like ribs from the earth. The pain registered and anger rose, and the shove that followed sent Homelander skidding into a bank of piping that flexed under the load. Black Noir closed again from the shadows, aiming for leverage at the base of the spine, and found his grip slipping as swelling muscle displaced the angle. The defensive sweep that followed sent him into a stack of warning placards that tore free under impact. Each exchange now unfolded in a space where there was nothing left to save. Command had one option that did not involve further pressure on the tanks: open the downstream locks and flood the access lanes to create a buffer between the fight and the remaining storage. The order went out with a hesitation that did not change its content, and somewhere beyond the yard, mechanisms that had been built for seasonal storms began to turn. The first surge came as a low rush along the service trench, then a sheet that rolled across the broken asphalt toward the river. The Hulk felt the change underfoot and moved with it, stepping into the rising water that cooled burns even as Homelander's heat vision traced new ones. Banner's influence found purchase in that direction, turning a defensive retreat into a choice that did not feed the loop. Starlight reached the edge of the flooding lane with a responder who could barely stand, and she dragged him behind a concrete divider as the water climbed. Her feed broke through the interagency net one last time, not to warn but to tell them to stop, because the locks were open and the yard was lost. A federal analyst answered with a clipped acknowledgement, and the heavier battery that had been staged along the port's edge fell silent. For the first time since the riot had begun, the plan yielded to the evidence. Butcher and Huey watched from the warehouse roof as the surge cut a dark path through flame, separating the fight from the tank line. A secure message arrived that confirmed interdiction had been authorized if any asset continued to escalate in defiance of command, and Butcher exhaled a breath he had been holding since the triage tent fell. Below, the Hulk stepped into deeper water and turned, not to pursue, but to hold distance from a cluster of responders scrambling along the floodwall. Homelander hovered above the rising sheet, eyes bright with a rage that had found no purchase in dominance, and for a moment the cameras that still worked caught uncertainty where certainty had lived. Vaught's briefing returned with a delay that spoke to the damage done, Ashley's voice tight as she emphasized joint command and humanitarian response. Legal prepared for inquiries that would arrive before dawn, and risk officers began calculating the cost of a yard that would not reopen this year. International commentators shifted from heroics to recovery, and markets prepared for a long morning. The decisive outcome would not be measured in victories. On the flooded access road, Homelander made one last pass that drove the Hulk back a step into water that now lapped at the berm. The shove that followed did not pursue. It created space, and the bound that came next carried the Hulk into the deeper channel beyond the floodwall. Regeneration closed the worst of the new cuts even as the current took hold, and the green silhouette moved away from a port that had lost its shape. Black Noir reached the water's edge and stopped, mandate colliding with a reality that offered no leverage. When the fires settled into a lower roar and the surge found its level, the yard was a cratered grid cut by dark water. Homelander remained above it, alone in air that no longer reflected a stage, and the responders below moved through a landscape that would take years to rebuild. The Hulk did not return to the streets that night, and the absence he left behind changed the rules by which Supes had operated. Governments that had watched a corporate asset fail in public began drafting oversight with a speed that surprised even them, and Vaught's monopoly on narrative broke along the same seam as the tank. The world did not return to normal. It returned to a different set of assumptions where force could not be franchised without consequence. The river carried the last of the smoke downstream, and in boardrooms and barracks alike, the night was logged as the moment control stopped being a promise and became a question that no one could answer alone.